History books did not lie to you. They inherited stories that hardened into facts. A grandson repeating a one-cut star trick, a miniature emperor stamping beneath a huge hat, and an opera warrior fitted with horns. The strangest case began in an industry trade journal, where a fictional sailor received a surname that turned a joke into history. Betsy Ross's flag. In the spring of 1776, a Philadelphia upholsterer named Betsy Ross ran a small shop on Arch Street, sewing ship flags and mending army uniforms. Family legend says George Washington walked in that year with a rough sketch, 13 stars and 13 stripes, and Betsy folded a scrap of cloth and cut it once with her scissors to show him a cleaner 5-pointed star. Teachers across mid-century America repeated that single snip as settled fact, but no letter, ledger, or newspaper from the 1770s ever mentions the visit at all. The story only surfaced in 1870, when Betsy's grandson William Canby stood before the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and told it in public for the first time, almost a century after it supposedly happened, backed only by sworn statements from his aunt and cousins, recalling what Betsy had once told them. Some historians point instead to Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. By 1780, he billed Congress for designing the national flag and suggested a quarter cask of public wine as payment. Treasury rejected the claim because others had also been consulted. Betsy Ross really did sew flags for the Continental Navy. At least a dozen other Philadelphia flag makers were doing the same work. The family story entered public record in 1870, 94 years after that supposed meeting. Napoleon's missing inches. Napoleon Bonaparte has been the world's favorite short man for 2 centuries, blamed for starting wars just to compensate for his size. When his body was measured on St. Helena in 1821, his personal doctor recorded the number in French feet and inches, 5'2". British newspapers copied the figure straight into English, without noticing that a French inch and an English inch were not the same length. Convert it properly, and Napoleon stood around 5'6" or 5'7", close to average for a Frenchman of his day, maybe even a touch above it. By then, the short joke was already working for someone else. By 1803, London cartoonist James Gilray was already drawing Little Boney as a furious miniature figure in an oversized hat, and the image spread faster than any correction ever could. Whether Gilray meant to build a lasting myth or simply found a size joke that sold prints, the picture won. Had a British printer done the arithmetic correctly at the outset, the world might never have needed a name for the Napoleon complex at all. The Vikings borrowed horns. Why does almost every drawing of a Viking warrior show him wearing a helmet with 2 curved horns on top, when a real horned helmet would have caught on every shield, sail rope, and low doorway inside a Viking-age longhouse? The answer has nothing to do with Scandinavia. At Bayreuth during 1876, German costume designer Karl Emil Doppler was dressing actors for the complete staging of Richard Wagner's opera cycle about Norse gods. He needed the villain Hunding to look fearsome from the cheap seats, so he bolted a pair of cow horns onto a metal cap. The composer's own wife, Cosima Wagner, wrote in her diary that the costumes looked more like a caricature of Native American chiefs than anything Norse, and some historians think Doppler really had borrowed the silhouette from feathered headdresses he'd seen in illustrated books. The National Museum of Denmark notes that the one preserved helmet from the Viking Age, found at Jernmundbu in Norway, has no horns. By 1958, Kirk Douglas wore horns on the movie poster for the Vikings, and a newspaper comic strip put horns on a cartoon Viking not long after. Had Doppler chosen a plain iron cap instead, the most familiar Viking silhouette in modern culture could have developed very differently. The rescue that came late. December of 1607, at the Powhatan village of Werowocomoco in Virginia, warriors force English Captain John Smith to the ground and press his head between 2 flat stones, clubs raised over him. Smith wrote about the capture in 1608, in his very first account sent back to London, and it ends with him fed, questioned, and released. No rescue, no girl throwing herself over his head, nothing of the kind. That detail only appears 16 years later, in a much longer book Smith published in 1624, after Pocahontas had already died in England and could no longer confirm or deny any of it. In that version, Powhatan's young daughter, about 10 or 11 at the time, throws her arms around Smith's head and begs her father to spare him. Mid-century American school books told it as history's first great romance between a colonist and a Native American princess. Some historians now argue the scene wasn't a rescue at all, but a formal Powhatan adoption ritual that Smith, watching with clubs raised over him, simply misread as a near execution. Whether Pocahontas saved his life, invented the danger, or performed a ceremony he never understood, no one who was there left a second account to check his story against. The sailor named Spaghetti. Dried pasta sits in almost every American pantry, and for decades the story behind it credited one explorer, Marco Polo, supposedly hauling noodles home from China in the 1290s. The real origin is older and much less romantic. A Muslim geographer named Al-Idrisi described a Sicilian town exporting bundles of dried noodle-like dough as early as 1154, well over 100 years before Marco Polo was even born. So where did the Marco Polo story actually come from? In October of 1929, an American trade magazine called the Macaroni Journal, published by the country's own pasta manufacturers, ran a short story about a Venetian sailor on Marco Polo's crew who supposedly discovered noodles in China. For the punchline, the article called it Sailor Spaghetti. It was fiction dressed up as history, written to give a food still linked in America to poor immigrant neighborhoods a more flattering origin story. By mid-century, cookbooks and classroom trivia were presenting it as history, and a 1938 Hollywood picture about Marco Polo helped the legend along. Pasta had already been crossing the Mediterranean for well over a century before anyone named Spaghetti supposedly carried it home. Columbus and the Round Earth. For generations, American schoolrooms told a dramatic scene in which Christopher Columbus faced scholars at Salamanca, who warned that his ships could sail off the edge of a flat world. During 1828, writer Washington Irving put that confrontation into his hugely successful biography of Columbus. Educated Europeans in 1492 had known the Earth was round for more than 1,000 years. A Greek mathematician named Eratosthenes had already calculated its size using shadows and geometry centuries before Christ was born, and a widely used medieval textbook by Johannes de Sacrobosco taught the same round Earth to university students 2.5 centuries before Columbus ever set sail. The real argument in Salamanca was about distance, not shape. Scholars insisted Asia was much farther away than Columbus claimed, and they were right. He had badly underestimated the ocean between Spain and Asia. American grade school lessons kept Irving's invented courtroom scene alive well into the mid-20th century. Had a second continent not happened to be sitting in his path, Columbus and his crews would likely have starved long before reaching land at all. The fiddle Nero never played. Rome, July 18th, 64 AD. Fire tears through wooden shops packed around the Circus Maximus, and a hot summer wind drives it street to street until 10 of Rome's 14 districts are burning or gone. But in 64 AD, Nero was at Antium when the fire began. Tacitus says he returned only when the flames approached his own house, then opened his gardens to the homeless, raised temporary shelters, brought in food, and cut the price of grain. So how did he end up remembered as the man who fiddled while his own city burned? Tacitus also records a rumor that Nero climbed onto a stage and sang about the fall of Troy while Rome smoldered, comparing the two disasters. He would have used a lyre or a kithara at most, since the violin, the actual fiddle, wouldn't exist for another 1,000 years or more. For anyone who grew up on the 1951 film Quo Vadis, Peter Ustinov's Nero plucking a lyre while Rome burns supplied the Hollywood image. The literal fiddle belongs to the later proverb. Ancient Rome had no violin. Whether Nero sang at all that night, or simply had enemies in the Senate eager to make sure people believed he did, is a question no surviving source ever settles. The brioche that wasn't hers. How could a child living in Austria say something that would define her reputation in France decades later? Around 1765, the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau was writing his memoirs and recalled an old story about an unnamed great princess who, on hearing the peasants had no bread, suggested they eat brioche instead. Rousseau never named her, and Marie Antoinette was still a child abroad when he wrote it, years before she ever set foot in France. Written versions tying the line to Marie Antoinette appear only decades after her death. Earlier variants were already attached to other royal women, including Marie Therese, wife of Louis XIV, who was associated with a similar remark about pastry crusts. Rousseau's Confessions was published in 1782, but he had written the passage before Marie Antoinette reached France during 1770. By the 1840s, the Brioche line was circulating under her name, long after Rousseau had recorded it without naming her. Had Rousseau simply written down which princess he meant, history might have needed to find a very different villain for that line. The ride that wasn't solo. On the night of April 18, 1775, Paul Revere left Boston to warn colonial leaders that British troops were on the move, and for most Americans, that's where the story ends. One man, one horse, one legendary ride. Generations of post-war schoolchildren memorized the poem describing it word for word. It still isn't the whole story, but on that same night in 1775, William Dawes followed another route, and the pair picked up a third messenger, young Dr. Samuel Prescott, on the road to Concord. Near the village of Lincoln, a British patrol stopped all three men. Dawes fell from his horse escaping and turned back hurt. Revere was captured outright and questioned before being let go without his horse. Only Prescott jumped a low stone wall and vanished into the trees, and only Prescott actually reached Concord to spread the warning. When Revere died in 1818, his hometown newspaper ran a long obituary praising his work as a silversmith and a mason, without a single line about that ride. It took a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, first published in December of 1860, 85 years after the ride, to turn Revere into a solo hero riding through the dark. Of the three men who left Lexington for Concord together, only Samuel Prescott reached Concord that night. If you liked this video, subscribe for more like it.